Hi everyone, it's Lauren. I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm going to be talking through and reviewing the books that I read in the month of February, and as always these will be linked in the description box below if you're interested in checking them out for yourself. I read 5 books last month and I think I'm going to talk about them in order of how much I like them, because I'm going to start with a book I didn't really get on with and finish with some books that I really enjoyed. So the first book I have is such a disappointment because I was really looking forward to reading this, and that's Strange Hotel by Emma McBride. Emma McBride wrote A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, which is one of my favourite books ever, and when I saw she had this new novella out, I was just so excited to read it. And I think it's just come off as a complete dud, in my opinion. This is about a woman who is visiting different hotels. Each section of the book is about her stay in a different hotel room in locations across the world. And typically with Emma McBride, the writing is very stream of consciousness. It sort of flips between her past. You know that she's dealing with some sort of grief, but you don't really understand what that is. It's also dealing with her thoughts of the future and also the feelings that she's having in this exact moment. So you get descriptions of the air conditioning or the feel of the carpet between her feet, crossed with these existential crises that she's having. Her writing to me always seems to be an exercise in trying to find the most truthful experience of what it's like to be in somebody's head. So there's lots of muddled thoughts and feelings, lots of interesting plays on words. But where this book falls short for me is that it's only 150 pages, and for a long time I felt like I didn't understand what this woman was doing or what her context was. It's not clear how often these hotel visits are happening until later on in the book, and it's only really in the last 50 pages or so, or maybe even less than that, where you get some actual context as to what's happened to her, and suddenly I was emotionally invested and connected with this woman. But before then, it's very, very vague. I think Emma McBride gets too caught up in her own tricks of playing with language and playing with different ideas, and she doesn't really stop to give you as the reader very much context, and it's very wordy, it's very difficult to read, which I feel like I could have got over if I had felt emotionally connected to this character. And because that happened so late in the book, and it's only 150 pages, and it felt like a real struggle to get through there, it meant that for me this really missed its mark, which is a shame because I think on reflection this book probably fulfilled what the author was setting out for it to do. But as a reader it just felt very, very confused and very difficult to engage with. A much better read, but still a little bit flat for me, was When the Lights Go Out by Caris Bray. This is a proof copy and this book comes out on the 7th of May. And again, I love Caris Bray's writing. I was very excited to read this new book, and although I did enjoy the journey that I went on because I enjoy her writing, I think as a book this felt a little bit off to me. So this is the story of a family. You've got the husband Chris, who is obsessed with climate change and really, really worried about it because there's been a lot of rain in their town, and he's worried about flooding. And then you have Emma, who is just trying to prepare for Christmas. They've got 2 teenage sons. I really enjoyed in this book the idea that Chris's obsession with climate change has morphed from worrying about recycling and using all their vegetable peelings into really the mentality of an end of the world prepper. He buys some rabbits for them because he thinks they have to be prepared to kill and eat their own rabbits, and he's very concerned about what's going to happen if suddenly the family were out of electricity, or if they weren't able to get antibiotics. And it's really become quite extreme in the form of almost conspiracy theories that he's worried about, and Emma hasn't really noticed it getting this far. And what was interesting for me is that him and Emma seemed to have a pretty good relationship still, and she seemed to still be in love with him, but at the same time think that he was crazy, really, with all of these schemes that he was coming up with. And because I love the way Caris Bray writes families, I really enjoyed their dynamic. I enjoyed the dynamic with their sons. You get some chapters from Chris's mother's perspective, who is very, very conservatively Christian, and you get a bit of his history when he was young. They used to have to go out and preach to people about Christianity, so it's interesting seeing the difference between that and now he's preaching to people in the street about the climate crisis. Equally with Emma's past, where she used to protest against different things in society, in their community, like closing down the libraries. There's a lot of really interesting themes in here about like the erosion of traditional societies, traditional communities, but also landscapes. That's nicely linked in with climate change. There's also an interesting juxtaposition in here between Emma and Chris's own marriage, and Emma contemplating that her marriage has subtly been changing over time and she hasn't noticed until suddenly it's very extreme, very similar to climate change. And although that is quite clever, it wasn't that clever because Caris Berry had to tell that to me. The plot doesn't go anywhere for a very long time. Like, even though I enjoyed the family, it felt like, all right, so what? For about 2/3, 3/4 of the book, I was like, yeah, okay, but why? Why am I following this family? And then there are a lot of resolutions right at the end, but it felt the pacing was a little bit off in general. And it's a shame because all of these characters, also Chris's sister and her husband, all of the different family dynamics, I think are excellently observed, very well written. So it was disappointing for me rather than it being a bad read. Next, I listened to an audiobook which was 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari, and I've not read any of his books before. I know he read, his previous books were Sapiens and Homo Deus, and they've been very well critically acclaimed and all the rest of it. And this is my first book by him because I thought this would be quite interesting because it's future looking, and each chapter takes a different aspect of global human society and these different challenges that we might be facing in the future. And this was extremely interesting. It's always a little bit weird and existential to listen to something this kind of scary and future looking in your ears. Like when you're listening to an audiobook, it feels quite intimate, and that was a little bit weird at times. Overall, I thought this was really interesting, but some of the chapters were a little bit hit and miss. So right at the beginning, the first 3 or 4 chapters I loved, and then it started to lose its way a little bit for me. And some of the concepts which I thought were super interesting was where he's discussing different global movements, like political ideals, and he looks at, earlier on in the century we had imperialism, which came to the end with the First World War. You then had the rise of fascism, which then came to the end. You then had the rise of capitalism v communism, which then came to an end. And at the moment, it feels like you have liberalism as this ideal, which is at the moment perhaps struggling, versus populism. And it's really interesting for him to take this huge big picture, he's a real big picture guy, and say, it feels like the world's ending, but it's not. Like, things change a lot. I also really liked his contemplations on the future of AI and how that's going to affect us, and biotechnology, what humans will look like in several hundred years, what jobs will be available for us, like how is society going to cope with the rise of these different changes, because we're not really prepared at the moment. And that was scary, but also very, very fascinating. But as I say, by the end of it, it felt like there wasn't necessarily a direction or a solution, which is fair. Like, he doesn't have to solve all of these problems for the whole of humanity by himself, but it felt a bit like, oh, okay, that presented lots of questions and didn't really solve any of them by the end of it. Although it was a very good read, very, very mind-opening, so I would recommend it. Finally, I have some excellent fiction which I very much enjoyed. And the first of these was Supper Club by Lara Williams. And this is a debut novel, which I think makes it even more impressive. So this is about a young woman called Roberta who is in her 20s, late 20s, doesn't really know what she wants to do. She meets a woman called Stevie at her work and they become very, very close friends, and eventually talk about this idea of a supper club, where they bring different women together and cook for one another, and it's all about the idea of women taking up space. So physical space, as in the locations where they host these dinners, and also space in themselves, as in putting on weight, getting fatter and eating what you want and not denying yourself anything. And it really looks at this idea of women being hungry for more and making themselves larger instead of diminishing themselves. And we jump between Roberta's present at Supper Club and also her past, mostly her time at university when she was incredibly lonely and got into the idea of cooking, and that really was her solace while she was young. And it also investigates a lot of very unhealthy relationships that she has with friendships with men, and it does feel like the unhealthy aspect and the lack of understanding boundaries seems to come from Roberta more than the other people in her lives, but each of them are in their own way flawed. And so it's a very interesting balancing act that this book manages. And I loved it. I really enjoyed the reading process of it. I thought everybody was very selfish and insular in their own way and didn't really understand how that affected other people. But equally, I really enjoyed the examinations that she makes of different women's lives, and especially their lives in relation to men and taking up space. The kind of feminist threads running through this book I thought were really good. Again, as you got to the end of this narrative, I felt like bits of plot lines started to drip off a little bit. The overarching plot of the supper club I thought was handled really well, and that ended really nicely. But different relationships in Roberta's life kind of didn't feel like they got resolved properly. I'm not sure if she really had a resolution for herself and her own past right at the end. So it felt a little bit like she'd got to a certain point and then didn't really know how she was going to end the book. And that was a little bit, but considering this is a first novel, I thought it was completely fantastic. And another aspect of the book that I did enjoy is the fact that all of the different women's sexualities are really just by the by, and they're not necessarily explained, but there is a lot of like queerness, bi-ness, gayness, whatever you want to call it, in the book, and it's just there. And I thought that was handled really nicely, and it's not necessarily has to be a big deal. So there are really, really good elements in this book, and I very much enjoyed the reading experience of it. And yeah, I think for a debut, it's just fantastic. And lastly, a book I very much loved, and that was Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier, which was lent to me by the lovely Jean. And this is a book that I read many years ago. I think I was 14 or 15 when I first read this book. It's the first in a series of, I think, 6. It was like an original trilogy, and then Juliet Marillier wrote a second trilogy afterwards. And I never read any of the other books. I don't know why. It was when I was a teenager and I was going through my Celt phase, and I just picked this up. And I had a really weird relationship with reading books when I was in my late teens, and I kind of found classic books boring, but I didn't really like YA stuff either, and I didn't really know what it was I wanted. So I don't know why I didn't keep reading this series. But reading it now as an adult, I really, really loved it. This is set in a magical, mythological version of Celtic Ireland, and we follow Sorcha, who is a young girl. She's the 7th child of a lord, and she acquires an evil stepmother who turns her 6 elder brothers into swans. And in order to reverse this spell, Sorcha has to weave shirts for them made out of a plant called starwort, which is essentially a stinging nettle, I think. And she has to remain silent, so she can't tell anybody what she's doing, why she's doing it, and she can't speak to anybody during the time that she's making the shirts. Once all 6 of them have been made, she can put them over her brothers' heads and they'll become men again. And this is a classic sort of legend, myth, tale that I'd heard before, and it's been reimagined by Juliet Marillier. And what I loved about it is that it really looks into the aspects of male and female power, which I think I have seen in the Blackthorn and Grimm series that we have been reading by Juliet Marillier. And I didn't notice any of this when I read this the first time when I was a teenager. And she really looks at how vulnerable Sorcha is as a woman by herself without any protection. And I think that I read this book at a time when I really needed it. It's a real escapist book, and I couldn't put it down, even though I knew how the story was going to end, because I had already read it. I was remembering exactly what had happened, to be fair, but I was still so fully engaged in it, and I love the story. It's pretty long, and it's like 500 pages, and I was fully engrossed all the way through. So I'm really pleased I picked this up. I'm glad I reread it. I can't wait to get on to the rest of the series. I've just been really loving reading Juliet Marillier. She's not the best writer in the world. And a lot of the people are either evil or really good, and I don't think people like that exist. But it's just so nice to get fully drawn into her stories, and I think for it being fantasy that was written quite a long while ago now, she's really looking at so many wider issues of living in that time. It's not just, oh, girl meets magical person and then has a magical journey. Like, she really looks at concepts of sexual violence and power that men have over women, especially powerful men. And, you know, this is looking at Sorcha's voice. She's lost her voice. She's lost a lot of power, but women still didn't have a very strong voice in this kind of society anyway. And I'm just loving it. Such a great experience reading her books. Let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books. I'd love to hear from you, and also let me know what else you've been reading in February, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.